Friends, good evening and welcome to Colorado Christian University's Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm John Andrews, Director of CCU's think tank, the Centennial Institute. It's Pearl Harbor Day. It's the day after the President addressed the nation about Islamic terrorism, sort of. It's a great day in the history of our 101-year-old, Christ-centered, excellent university, Colorado Christian University. Students, faculty, administration, trustees, special friends of the university, Centennial Institute Policy Fellows, Centennial Institute 1776 Scholar students. It's great to have all of you here for our special guest, the Honorable Richard B. Cheney, the 46th Vice President of the United States. We'll hear from Dick Cheney in just a few minutes. I want to invite up one of our 1776 scholars to begin us as we properly should on this or any occasion with a prayer and then the Pledge of Allegiance to our beloved flag. Please welcome now CCU Junior from Amarillo, Texas, Beth Hudson Wilkes. Beth?
Please stand with me for the prayer. Dear God, thank you for gathering us all here safely this evening. We thank you for allowing us to live in a country with the freedoms to meet and worship you openly without fear. God, we ask for safety during this unstable time in our nation's history. Help us Christians to know how to represent you well during this time, and give us courage that we need to stand up for our faith. Lord, we pray for the upcoming elections. We ask that you would appoint people who support religious freedoms and who will lead our country in a way that is honoring to you. Please bless Mr. Cheney this evening, and we thank you for the opportunity CCU has to hear from such a distinguished man. In your name we pray, amen. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Beth Wilkes, thank you very much, and please be seated. On a peaceful Sunday morning in the middle of the Pacific, 74 years ago today, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, a Japanese attack devastated the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. There's a living memorial, a ship that's never been taken out of commission, even though she rests on the bottom of the harbor, the USS Arizona. Aboard the Arizona that day was someone who is our special guest this evening, and I want you to meet through a moment of video, and then we'll invite him up here for you to recognize and honor him. Navy veteran, Pearl Harbor survivor, USS Arizona crewman, Donald Stratton. Let's have the video.
I think it was just an adventure, going to sea or whatever. Going to sea. I graduated from high school and joined the Navy. I was in the 6th Division, which was a boat division, and we were in charge of the 5-inch 25 anti-aircraft guns on the port side, and I was a sight setter and the port director, which was one deck above the bridge. I just finished breakfast, and some sailors were yelling on the bow of the ship about doing something on Ford Island there, so I go up and check it out, and sure enough, when the planes peeled away and I could see the big red Japanese insignia, and I knew it was the Japanese right away, and they were bombing Ford Island. So I started for my battle station, and we started firing at them. At that time, the whole world thought the battleship was the extreme weapon on the high seas. Well, now it is not. It's the aircraft carriers and the aircraft. I could see the torpedo planes coming in and the torpedoes in the water. I could see the Pennsylvania over here in dry dock and the West Virginia and the Tennessee and ahead of us and the Nevada behind. Just everybody was getting hit, but the dive bombers and the strafers and the high altitude bombers is what was hurting us. We had to train our guns up 90 degrees to try to hit the high altitude bombers. And the Arizona caught this hit and it blew up and it shook the ship and it blew 110 foot of the bow of the ship off. We were inside of this director, and of course that protected us a little bit because the director was thin-walled steel, but well, we got caught in that ball of fire with no place to go. And it seemed like forever, but finally the flames died down and the vessel was tied up alongside of us, which is a repair ship, and smoke drifted away, and we sighted a sailor on the vessel and got him attention. He threw us a heaving line and hooked on a heavier line. We pulled it across to the Arizona and tied it off. And we proceeded to go across that line hand over hand to the vessel after we were hurt, after we were burnt. The Japs were still pounding us and strafing us and the whole bit. And they finally got a shoreboat and got us in a shoreboat and took us over to the dock. And they put us in an open air truck and took us to the U.S. Naval Hospital there in Pearl Harbor. The Arizona burned for 3.5 days after that. 1 million pounds of ammunition exploded. Aviation gas, fuel oil. They lost 1,177 men on the Arizona. And just a horrible day.
As Director of Centennial Institute, Jeff Hunt, along with Colorado military hero, Donald Stratton.
Thank you, sir.
Now, when I did my research on Mr. Stratton here, this isn't the largest audience that he's received a standing ovation. In fact, the entire Broncos audience one time honored him at Mile High Stadium with a standing ovation. So we were honored to have you here. The Vice President wanted to personally give you a signed book that he wrote, a little note to you there.
Okay.
But on behalf of all of us here at Colorado Christian University, thank you, sir.
Thank you all for being. Thank you for being there for all the vets and all the veterans and all the people. I wish we were together now like we were then. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Don. God bless you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Donald Stratton and Centennial Institute's incoming director, one of the brightest, most able young Christian conservatives in America today. You'll love getting to know him, working with him, and watching what he does with Centennial Institute, Jeff Hunt. Now, for the purpose of introducing our honored guest and his distinguished interviewer, please meet another of our 1776 scholar students associated with Centennial Institute. Welcome Joe Maroney, CCU Junior from Arvada, Colorado. Joe.
Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. This philosophy, this principle, originally stated by the philosopher George Santayana, still remains true today. If we fail to know and to understand our past, we will certainly not be ready to handle our future. Ladies and gentlemen, what a treat we have for you tonight. It is an immense honor of mine to be introducing to you the Honorable Dick Cheney, the 46th Vice President of the United States. Serving in the White House with President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009, he has held a unique vantage point on America's involvement in the world during a foundational and a pivotal period. Vice President Dick Cheney was nominated by President George H.W. Bush as the Secretary of Defense and served in this capacity from 1989 to 1993. During this time, he led several important operations, including Desert Storm in Iraq, as well as Just Cause in Panama. And as Vice President, at the turn of the 21st century, he faced a challenge of a new enemy and a new battlefield: terrorism. He and his daughter, Liz Cheney, co-authored a work in this year titled Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Strong America. ISIS, global terrorism, Syria's civil war, Iran versus Israel, Russian aggression, North Korea's instability, and our own national security. All of these are just a few issues that are now mounting and building up to a climax in our age. And America's address to the world must be strong, it must be clear, and it must be defined. The most important question that we should have on our minds is, how do we prepare for and act against the threat to our country and to the world? And what better way to answer these questions and these threats than to hear from a man who has insight to where they started? Moderating the conversation tonight is also an honorable guest, Hugh Hewitt, a visiting professor at CCU, teaching on the First Amendment as well as, ironically, the great issues of the 21st century. Hugh Hewitt is a national syndicated radio host for Salem Radio, granting us the information and awareness to the daily issues that we see in our country. Both of our guests tonight have had their fair share of firsthand experiences to the crucial events that are part of our history that is unfolding today. And as you have all experienced, today marks the 74th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, where 2,403 Americans died during a surprise attack by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor at the beginning of World War II. In honor of these men and women that sacrificed their lives for us and our country, let us not be caught off guard again. Let us not repeat history. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Hugh Hewitt and Vice President Dick Cheney.
Thank you, everyone. It's a great honor, and I want to thank President and Senator Bill Armstrong, the President of Colorado Christian University, John Andrews, the Director currently of Centennial Institute, every distinguished guest we have tonight, and all the trustees of CCU for making this happen. Mr. Vice President, it's great to be with you again, and I'm sure that you join me in saying to Mr. Stratton, thank you for his years of service in beginning at Pearl Harbor. Watching the video made me think you've served 4 commanders-in-chief, President Nixon, President Ford, the first President Bush, and of course, as Vice President, the second President Bush. What's the most important aspect of being a commander-in-chief?
Well, I think it starts, in my opinion, it starts with somebody who understands the world we live in, who correctly analyzes and thinks about and understands the world we live in, who earns the support of the American people by his wisdom and by his thoughtful care and concern about the nation, and who's prepared to make unbelievably difficult decisions. Decisions that most people would shy away from if they actually had to cope with what the president's asked to cope with, especially about military matters, especially when it comes time to deploy the force, to send young men and women in harm's way on behalf of all of us, to keep us safe and to make certain that we are able to prevail over any enemy.
You mentioned on my radio show earlier tonight, in 1991, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq, you had to go visit with the King of Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. What was it that persuaded the king to trust you in the United States, that you would follow through on your commitment to come, to conquer, and then to leave?
Well, the way it happened, this is the first weekend of the Gulf crisis. It's just a couple of days after Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and my mission was to go persuade King Fahd then of the importance of the threat that he faced from Saddam Hussein, who had taken Kuwait at that point, and that we were prepared to come assist, but to convince them also of the urgency of the matter. And it was possible. There was one difficulty to overcome, and that was that in 1979, when the Shah fell and the mullahs took over in Iran, the Saudis had requested some indication of U.S. commitment and involvement in their security. And so President Carter sent a squadron of F-15s as a measure of our commitment to Saudi Arabia. But when they were halfway there, he announced they were unarmed. And I had to persuade the Saudis this time that we weren't sending any unarmed aircraft, that this was going to be the full-up job. He was, I worked with him a lot. There used to be a lot of small talk when you'd meet. This time around, he was deadly serious from the very beginning. He understood what was at stake. After we'd made a presentation, Norm Schwarzkopf was with me, and we did a lay down of the threat and what we proposed to do. Then the interpreter quit interpreting, and they turned to the Saudis and talked among themselves in Arabic. And then he turned back to me and he said, "Okay, we'll do it, but on two conditions. You have to promise you'll bring enough to get the job done, no more unarmed F-15s, and you have to leave when it's over with." And I gave him my word. The president obviously had approved that arrangement, and they signed up. There's a historic relationship there that we had with the Saudis, and it was a very close one until the Obama administration.
The tensions between the present administration and our Middle East allies of longstanding note, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, are well known. How long will it take a next president to repair those, if indeed it's possible to repair those?
Well, it'll take some time. I mean, the important thing is obviously that we replace the president. His term will be up in a year. And last time I was out there visiting, I made the point that this is a historic relationship between the U.S. and our friends in the region, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Emirates, and that it's temporary. There will be a new administration. And their response to me was, "Yes, Dick, but he's going to be in there for 2 more years," or whatever it was. They were very concerned at that point. I think it'll take some serious effort by the next president to reestablish those relationships. They'll be relieved that Obama is no longer the president. They would expect to see a fairly quick change in policy. I think the other thing they'll watch is to see whether or not we rebuild our military. And one of the things they count on is the state of the U.S. military. And our military has been badly damaged, weakened by this administration.
We saw the video of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. That became one front in a two-front war. Right now in the Middle East, there's the Iranian problem and there's the ISIS problem. Which is the greater threat, and how would you advise the next president to manage? I don't think this current president's going to listen to you or me, but how would you advise the next president to manage a two-front war, which is actually, unlike the first war, right up against each other?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Hugh, and it's not easy. I don't know if we can take the rest of the evening to talk about the problem, but basically you have in Syria civil war that has helped precipitate the creation of ISIS. ISIS partly grew out of the old Al-Qaeda, and they've moved and established caliphate, which is a big, big deal. It's not just a piece of real estate. It has great meaning from a religious standpoint to Muslims all over the world. And the problem we have now, it's become a safe harbor, a sanctuary from which they launch attacks against us, i.e. San Bernardino this week, Paris a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's very important that that caliphate be eliminated. I think it's got to be your objective in that part of the world. That's easier said than done, but that ought to be our objective, and we ought to build a strategy around that objective. With respect to Iran, I think the first thing we have to do is to abrogate the agreement Obama signed with the mullahs on nukes. I think that agreement is a travesty. It will clearly allow the Iranians ultimately to acquire nuclear weapons. It's going to give them $150 billion, which they'll get. That's been locked up through the sanctions. They'll continue to fund terrorism, the biggest state sponsor of terror in the world today, and Hamas and Hezbollah and other organizations that are supported by them will become even more active in the area. And the other thing that it'll do is it will encourage the proliferation of nuclear technology in that part of the world. Others, friends of ours, the Saudis, the Emirates, the Egyptians, and so forth, who have not developed nuclear weapons, they've always relied upon the support of the United States, and nobody at that point, except the Israelis, had one in the region. But when the Iranians become armed with nuclear weapons, everybody else is going to try to find some way to acquire their own capability. They'll feel, based on recent events, that they can no longer count on the United States, and you will have a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and that's Katie bar the door. That's a tremendous problem. We've already had proliferation in that part of the world in the past. Iraq, Saddam Hussein built a reactor at a Sirik outside Baghdad in '81. Israelis took it out. He rebuilt his program in '90. We took it out in Desert Storm in '91. When we took down Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya surrendered his nuclear program. He had centrifuges, he had uranium feedstock, he had a weapons design. He surrendered all of that to us because of what we'd done to Saddam, and he was afraid he was next. You know, there are numerous examples along the way where there have in fact been efforts in the Middle East to acquire nuclear capability. The Pakistanis have it. They had a guy who put their program together who sold that technology to the Iranians. The North Koreans built a reactor in Syria that the Israelis destroyed in '07. So the pattern's established. It's already happened many times in the past. The thing that stopped it previously is the use of force or the threat of military force. This time around, Obama didn't do that. He, in fact, bribed them to come back to the table, gave them everything they could conceivably ask for, and said that force wasn't an option. I think it's a terrible mistake, and it'll do enormous damage, 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Now, President Obama frequently counsels President Putin on what he should and should not do, and I don't believe that President Putin listens to him very much. But I think President Putin might actually listen to Dick Cheney even at one remove. Is he making a strategic error by aligning with Assad and the Iranians, in your opinion, for the good of Russia?
No. Obama says that repeatedly. But Putin is ex-KGB, and people say they looked in his eyes and saw his religious convictions, if you can call them that, or his loyalty to the principles of the KGB. That's what he was. That's how he came up, and that's what he still is today. He's a dangerous man. His big objective, I believe, is to try to recreate at least part of the old Soviet empire. He said one of the greatest disasters to befall mankind was when the Soviet Union broke up. And most of us think it was a significant move in the proper direction, but he's thinking very much about how he can reassemble some of that. He's already done it with Crimea. He's done it with part of Ukraine. I think he has aspirations with respect to the Baltics, to Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. He has now reestablished Russia in a significant way back into the Middle East. You know, we ran him off when we got Sadat to kick him out back in '73 after the Yom Kippur War. But he's back and in a fairly creative way. He's selling arms to the Iranians. He's allied himself with the Iranians and the Syrians, the three of them together. He is bombing, running airstrikes in Syria, but the people he's bombing are the ones that Obama's been supporting. Obama looks at that and thinks there are relationships there that just aren't there. And I think Putin at this point is feeling his oats. He believes Obama's weak. He believes as long as Obama's in office, he's got opportunities to move in the direction of trying to reclaim some of that old territory. I think what he'd love to do is threaten the Baltics to the point where they perhaps are told they need to withdraw from NATO or try to undermine NATO. I think that's one of his big objectives. If he can prove NATO is weak and relatively ineffective, he'll consider that a major victory.
Now, Mr. Vice President, you've dealt with so many generals, Norm Schwarzkopf, David Petraeus, Odierno, McChrystal, Mattis, all these great warfighters. What do you think is the attitude in the DOD? They'll never say a word against the president, nor should they. That's not their job. But what do you think is the attitude in the military right now about the president and now Secretary of Defense Ash Carter and this entire pivot that we've made?
Well, obviously I can't speak for the military. I had enough trouble doing that when I was secretary. But no, they're loyal Americans. They take the oath of office. They understand the whole principle of civilian control of the military. They honor it, and that's as it should be. But you have some like General Flynn. Who's General Flynn? Well, he was the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Normal tour in that post is about 4 years. He left after 3. You can speculate whether he left or was pushed, but he's very open about his problems as he sees them, and he's especially important because he's very much in control of a big part of the intelligence structure inside the Department of Defense. And he has repeatedly, if you watch for his words in the press, he's frequently a commentator on TV. He basically says that all this time that Obama has been spinning out a false narrative about how Al-Qaeda has been defeated, ISIS is the JV, they're contained. He knows what was in the intelligence reports. He was collecting and preparing those reports and sending them forward to the White House. And he will say, and he said it publicly since he left, that in fact they are ignoring the intelligence that said that Al-Qaeda is on the march, that ISIS is on the march, that the threat to the United States is growing, there's great danger ahead, and that Obama has chosen just to ignore the facts while he peddles his narrative that somehow he's defeated the terrorist threat to the United States. It's not true. General Flynn, regularly goes out and very forthrightly tells the truth. Jack Keene's another one to watch. Jack was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, a superb officer. He was a guy who helped us put the surge together in '07 and '08. One of the finest officers I've known, and he's retired now, but he's very active as an analyst. You'll see him frequently on television. He's another good one to listen to.
Would you expect a new president to perhaps reach back to some of the successful warfighters, whether it's General Petraeus or General Mattis or General McChrystal, and ask them to return to duty? I believe you guys did that with Pete Schoomaker. I believe you went to the retired ranks and brought back someone.
We did. Pete Schoomaker was brought back. He'd had a great career in the military. He was a special ops guy, Delta and so forth. And he came back. We asked him to come back and to become the Army Chief of Staff. I actually was asked to contact him because, because he was a Wyoming guy, played football at the University of Wyoming. And Don Rumsfeld, who was SecDef, said, "Don't you know him?" And I said, "Yeah, I can get hold of him." And so I called him, and when I got him, he was in his pickup truck driving around Wyoming looking for a ranch to buy. And he had to postpone that for 4 years. He came in and did an absolutely superb job for us, and it has been done.
So when you look at the Pentagon from the perspective of someone who served as vice president for 8 years and is SecDef, how much rebuilding and how long will it take to do?
Building the Pentagon, building that magnificent force that we've had in the past, is the work of years. One of the things I did right after Desert Storm, as soon as the war ended, that very day, I called former President Reagan, who was then retired, living in Beverly Hills, and got him on the phone and thanked him for all of that stuff he bought back in the early 80s that was available to us to use in the early 90s to defeat Saddam Hussein. And the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and the Abrams tanks and the F-15 fighters, that magnificent force that had been trained and equipped on his watch is what we had to go to war with. And it was a magnificent force. It was one of the best things he did as president, and we were the beneficiaries of it. The thing I worry about now is that there isn't going to be anybody down the road who's going to look back at the Obama administration and expect a call from, or make a call thanking Obama or his associates for what they did to the military, because it's devastating. It takes a long time to train a command master sergeant, to build and operate that equipment, train people to do what we do from the military standpoint. And it's not like building a highway. You don't just let a contract and boom, there's a road. You're dealing usually with new equipment, lots of times brand new technologies. You've got to keep that edge to stay in front of our potential adversaries. They haven't done it. The other problem we have is that as long as you're on top and people look and say, well, there's the United States, this is what they did in Desert Storm, ran a 4-day war and about a 6-week air war, and achieved remarkable results and only had 148 killed in action. And that stood for a lot as our adversaries around the world, whether it's the Russians or whoever it might be, looked at the United States. Today, what do they see when they look at the United States? Are we somebody who needs to be feared and respected? Or are we the guys who drew the line in the sand about chemical weapons in Syria and then backed off? They look at the Iranian deal as a classic example that our interests are not their interest, that we in fact have changed sides, we reversed course, we've turned our backs on many, many years of policy when we signed up with Iran. So it will take a long time to do it. We're talking about a period of years, and it will take some time to convince both our friends and our adversaries that we're going to do it.
Are we vulnerable right now to 9/11 or a Pearl Harbor style attack?
Yes. And if you go back, Hugh, I did an interview in the spring of '01. I was asked, I think I ran in a New York magazine, I was asked what was the biggest threat facing the country, and this is a few months before 9/11, and I said, I'm worried about terrorists equipped with weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, or nukes. And then, of course, what happened on 9/11, we had 19 guys with airline tickets and box cutters, and they launched an attack that was worse than Pearl Harbor. It was in the homeland, it took down the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killed 3,000 of us. Would have taken out the Capitol or the White House if it hadn't been for the courage of the folks on United 93. Now that was, 14 years ago. Things have come a long way since then. And I think the threat level today is greater than it was after 9/11. I think you've got not only the proliferation of Islamic radicalism and extremists, they are now launching attacks into Europe, attacks into the United States. Took down a Russian airliner, 224 people killed over the Sinai. There isn't any geographical limitation on them. Anybody who sits around now and thinks, gee, we're safe behind our oceans and we can turn our back and let somebody else worry about that, forget that. Just ask the folks in San Bernardino if we're immune from those kinds of attacks. Now you can say, well, it was just people armed with rifles and pistols, and they only killed 14 of us. Well, if you start to think about the combination of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction that's going on now in the Middle East and the proliferation of terrorist organizations. It doesn't take much. If you can get a device on a ship and sail it into the middle of New York Harbor, or put it in a semi and drive it around the Beltway outside Washington, and then all you need is somebody who knows how to set it off and is willing to die for Allah. And that's increasingly possible. So for us to think that somehow we're safer than we were at the time of 9/11, I think the world's a much more dangerous place. I think our adversaries are deadlier. I think they've spread pretty dramatically from a geographical standpoint. I think ISIS is a whole new ballgame, tougher, meaner, more vicious than we had in Al-Qaeda. And people think that that's a one-off event, 9/11 even, or the kinds of things we've seen recently in Paris and here in the United States. They're just wrong. And then Barack Obama, I don't think, understands or pretends not to understand. I spend hours trying to figure out what makes him tick, but it's as though he has a worldview that's different than what most of us hold. And when facts are brought to show that he's wrong, he just ignores those facts and stays right on his set of beliefs. It's okay to do business with the Iranians. They can be trusted. Don't pay any attention to their record of support for terrorism on a global basis.
Mr. Vice President, we have a lot of friends and allies in the Muslim world. You mentioned King Fahd, King Salman, King Hussein, and you mentioned on my radio show tonight you have enormous respect for President el-Sisi. How do we communicate with them in the political climate of today? And it's headlines all over the place about the Syrian refugees, about immigration policy to the United States, visas. How do we communicate at the same time we communicate worrisome news about the radical Islamist fringe, and at the same time that we are allies and reliable friends? How do you do that?
Well, first of all, most of them don't trust us. General el-Sisi, who I've spent a couple hours with while he was still a general before he became president of Egypt, and I was very impressed. And I've been impressed with how he's handled himself since. He's one of those leaders, a military leader who's Muslim, Egyptian, but he went to the most important religious institution almost in the Muslim world, the university in Cairo, and basically laid it on the line and said, you guys have got to get your act together. I mean, he was willing to lecture some of the religious leaders of his own faith. I haven't heard anybody else do that. He told me something very interesting and frankly very, very disturbing. He said, and this is a guy who commanded the military, which is pretty good military in that part of the world, armed and equipped with U.S. weapon systems, U.S. training, worked very closely with our military. He said he'd like to come to Washington, but instead he'd gone to Moscow. Not because he wants to make nice with the Russians, but because the people of Egypt are convinced this administration supported the Muslim Brotherhood, the group that got Morsi in office, the radical Islamist president that they eventually overthrew and has since been imprisoned. But the people of Egypt are convinced. His domestic political body that he has to deal with are so convinced the U.S. and the Obama administration are the bad guys that have created problems for them, that have tried to legitimize the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth, that it's not politically safe for a president of Egypt to come spend time with Barack Obama.
Mr. Vice President, we have Senator Armstrong sitting here in the front row, President of Colorado. Christian, you yourself was the President of the United States Senate by order of the Constitution, and your bust was just dedicated in the United States Capitol. Do you think the Senate is uniquely dysfunctional now, or has it always been that way?
Do you mean, was it that way before they put my bust up there? Or the Senate's the Senate. And I know you can look back the Senate and the Congress and find it's frustrating and dysfunctional and so forth, and lots of times it is. And there are times when I'm not that disturbed by it, because I'm one of those people who thinks, I'm not sure we want to enact more laws. We've already got enough stuff on the book. But I think it's interesting. We now have more Republicans in the House of Representatives than any time since 1929. We've got the nucleus of a very good government there. We've got control of the Senate. We don't have enough to break a filibuster, but the House and the Senate are, I think, well led. Paul Ryan is a great friend. His presence now as Speaker, he's a very good man, and I think he'll do good work there. He'll work well with Mitch McConnell. Now what we need is a president to go along with that, and that's why this election's so important.
Now, the vice president stayed far away from the current political drama in the Republican Party, and I'm not going to ask him to do anything other than that, but what advice would you give to whomever the Republican Party nominates about the vice president they select? You have a unique observation point, having served in the office and having led the search party for a vice president before. What ought they to be looking for in 2016 as a running mate?
Well, I served twice in the search capacity. Once for Jerry Ford when he had to replace Nelson Rockefeller, and then for 43. I think there's only one key requirement that's more important than anything else, and that's the capacity of that individual to be President of the United States. And when you get into this business of you're looking for geographical balance, or do they come from the right wing of the party or the left wing of the party, they've got certain kinds of experience. We need business experience, or we need gubernatorial experience. All of that is interesting, but it's not crucial. The very real fact is, you go in and as soon as you take that oath, if something happens to the president, he gets hit by a truck on the way back to the White House, you're it. You're the one who's going to have the military aid following you around with a briefcase that has the nuclear codes in it to execute the PSYOP. I had that when I was vice president as a backup to the president. I was there 24 hours a day. And in that briefcase are the codes that are needed to launch a nuclear war. And you're going to put somebody in as president who doesn't have a clue about national security, or doesn't understand what's at stake, or how the world works, or what's going on in in Russia? I don't think so. And I know when I did it with Jerry Ford, and we ended up with Bob Dole, or this is an awkward thing to say, when we got me. And I turned the job down when it was first offered, and I didn't want to become vice president. I was happy in private life. But the president finally convinced me I was the right guy to do what he wanted to have done. But that's the thing that's got to be foremost in your mind. And there are times in the past when presidents have picked vice presidents, and that hasn't been a factor. And I think that's a mistake. It's happened in both parties. I won't dwell on individuals or names, but that has to be the sole requirement is, can this individual take over if he needs to tomorrow?
Now, I'd like to take one or two very quick questions and ask whoever asks it from the audience to be very, very brief. We have two microphones here. Put up your hand. In framing it, we got one right behind you, Jim, right back there. Come on up. Very, very brief, because we're pressed for time.
Mr. Vice President, I was actually a Marine when you were SecDef and for Vice President. My question is, what do you think the likelihood would be in Barack Obama ordering the military out of Guantanamo Bay and offering it to Cuba in light of our newfound relationship, and therefore de facto giving Guantanamo Bay to Cuba, because since he is commander-in-chief, he can order the military out of there. Cuba can walk in, and then what are we going to do? I mean, we're going to start a war to get Guantanamo back?
It's a good question. Congress so far has been successful at putting amendments on appropriations bills to prohibit him from closing Guantanamo, partly by what's he going to do with the prisoners that are there. And they've been able, through legislative amendments, to maintain the status quo. I would hope they'd move in that direction again. If he hasn't thought of giving those orders, and this is the first time I've ever heard of it, that raises interesting questions. He is the commander-in-chief. But it would only be temporary. My guess is you could slow down the process enough so that the decision be made by the next administration. But I think it'd be unfortunate. Thank you for your service in the Marine Corps.
Over there, question number 2.
Hello. Oh, it's kind of loud. Mine's a political question. Obviously, there's so much discussion about all the various different presidential candidates, but nobody seems to be focused on the electoral map and the fact that whoever the Republican candidate is, they basically have to win 3 states or it's game's over. And those 3 states, of course, are Virginia, Ohio.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you...
I said my question's a political question.
Right, the Electoral
So
College.
it really comes down to the Electoral College. And of course, the Democrats have a huge, huge advantage. They have some 230 votes no matter what.
Question?
Question. Why aren't we talking about that? Because whoever the Republican candidate is, they have to win the 3 key states of Virginia, Ohio, Florida. For example, Mr. Trump, there's no way he could possibly carry those states.
So what about the Electoral College? Is it
Electoral
unbreakable?
College is very important, but there's no preordained reason why the Democrats have to win those states. Obviously, they'll be favored and some have an advantage. We'll be favored in others. President Bush and I managed to get elected. It was a little close that first time out. But to get elected twice because we went out and won the votes, and that's what has to happen this time too.
Last question to one of my students. Go ahead, Jared.
You've talked a lot about politics and military history, but this is a personal question that I've always been wondering following you, and that is, are you a follower and believer of Jesus Christ of Nazareth who sits upon the white throne?
A religious question at Colorado Christian University is appropriate, but I'm not sure we should put him on the spot, Mr. Vice President.
Well, I am a Christian. I was raised in the Methodist Church and married a woman from the Presbyterian Church, and we got married in an Episcopal church, kind of genetic. But I, having just been through serious heart problems a few years ago, I had the personal experience. By the time 17 months after I left the White House, I was in end-stage heart failure. I went through a very, very difficult set of surgeries to put in a pump that bought me 20 months, that got me to the point where I could get a heart transplant 4 years ago, March. That was a religious experience. There's no question in my mind, but what thanks not only obviously to a donor and to modern medical technology, but thanks to the prayers of thousands of people all over the country who prayed for me. And I'm convinced that's part of the reason I'm here today.
Thank you, Jared. And a last question from me. Colorado Christian University is one of the institutions that is sued to protect its religious liberty under Obamacare. Mr. Vice President, do you worry about the state of religious liberty in America under this administration going forward and with this court?
Well, I would have ordinarily, in years past, I would have said religious liberty is here to stay in the United States. It's part of our basic founding and principles and set of beliefs. My ancestors were Puritans who came here to flee persecution in Europe in the 1630s. But I am worried. I think we have to be cautious. It's one of those things we need to guard against. We need to make certain that we reinforce that basic fundamental principle that's so important to all of us. And there may be people out there, politicians, who want to challenge that. But I think thanks to organizations like Colorado Christian University and all that it stands for and represents, the freedom of religion, our ability to believe and worship as we see fit, is just fundamental rock foundation of the United States. And I think if somebody does seriously try, and I know periodically there are temptations, but I think there would be an awful lot of Americans who would be willing to man the barricades to make certain that doesn't happen.
Mr. Vice President, thank you.
Vice President Dick Cheney, Hugh Hewitt, we began with God, we conclude With him, Mr. Vice President, we wish for you and your family God's rich blessing, a long life. We wish all of you a blessed Christmas and a bright New Year. We'll see you again with more Centennial Institute and CCU programming in 2016. Vice President Cheney's important new book, co-authored with his daughter Liz, Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Strong America, is on sale at audience right on the west door as you would exit. We do look forward to seeing you again in 2016. We must work together to save and rescue this country because the world is counting on us all. Dick Cheney, Hugh Hewitt, thank you very much. We are adjourned.